Hey there. Tonight, we slide into the powdered, perfumed, panic-laced world of 17th and 18th century Versailles, place where ambition wore silk shoes, gossip wore rouge, and failure smelled faintly of lavender and fear. So before you settle into your pillow like a jaded courtier collapsing onto brocade cushions, go ahead and dim the lights, fluff the sheets, maybe spritz a little rose water in the air, if you want to be historically accurate, or don't. I won't tell Louis. If you enjoy this absurd historical journey, consider liking and subscribing, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and how many metaphorical wigs you'd be willing to wear for power. Spoiler, it's never enough now. Imagine you're a young noble, a minor one. Let's not get delusional. And someone says the words, "You're being summoned to Versailles." There it is, the dream, the golden gates of greatness, the marbled path to elegance, the staircase to immortality, assuming you don't trip halfway up in your borrowed shoes. You were born into a family with enough nobility to technically own cutlery, but not enough to afford a second pair of breeches. You've spent your youth in the countryside, surrounded by sheep with more influence than you. Your greatest achievement so far, not stepping in goose droppings during Sunday Mass, but now, Versailles. You received a letter 2 weeks ago, sealed with wax so thick it looked like it was applied by someone having an emotional breakdown. It used grand words like honored and summoned, which in the language of court politics roughly translates to, "We need more decorative furniture with pulses." And so, you began your journey. A cart, a cow, 3 rainstorms, and 1 suspicious meat pie. Later you arrive. Versailles. It doesn't look real. Golden gates that shimmer like lies. Endless windows glaring down at you like judgmental aunties. Gardens so vast they need their own zip codes. Statues of gods, goddesses, and confused cherubs, all looking vaguely disappointed in your outfit. You try to look confident. You fail, because Versailles isn't just a palace. It's a machine, one that processes ambition, grinds it into paste, and uses it as shoe polish for dukes who haven't smiled since Louis XIII coughed into a goblet. You step forward. The gates creak open, not for you specifically, but you pretend. That's rule number 1 at Versailles. Pretend everything is for you, until someone corrects you. And even then, keep pretending. A man greets you. Well, greets is generous. He glides past you like a humid breeze. He's wearing a blue velvet coat that costs more than your house, and has a face that suggests he once smiled, but decided against it. His name is Etienne. He is your guide, and he hates everything. First time at court, he asks, voice like dust and disdain. You nod. He sighs like it hurts. Try not to bow too low, he mutters. It's desperate. And never laugh too quickly, or too slowly, or at all, really. Humor is for peasants and playwrights. You don't laugh, good start. You're assigned a room. Room is again generous. It's a glorified storage closet, containing 1 straw mattress, 1 cracked mirror, a painting of a goat that might be judging you in Gaston, a rat the size of political ambition. You share this luxurious accommodation with 2 other courtiers. Jacques, who insists he's descended from royalty. He's not, and Olivier, who cries in his sleep and smells faintly of Cabagesian, says, "You're lucky. Last week, a marquis had to sleep in a chimney." You nod like this is normal. Then comes La Lever, the royal wake-up ritual. This, you are told, is the pinnacle of court life. The moment when the king awakens, and dozens of fully grown nobles gather around his bed to watch. Yes, you heard that correctly. Watch. No. One knows exactly why. Perhaps to absorb his morning glow. Perhaps to fight over who gets to hand him his underpants. Either way, you join the crowd. You stand in a golden room with too many mirrors and not enough oxygen. The king yawns. A trumpet plays. Someone weeps. A bishop sneezes. You blink and hope it was allowed. One noble hands the king his Roby another hands him a sock. A third bows so low his wig falls off and rolls under the chaise. You stand near the back and try not to faint. And yet, despite the madness, something stirs inside you, ambition or indigestion, hard to say. You're told there will be a grand breakfast. You picture pastries, meat, butter, and a gentle string. Quartet. Reality. You are not invited. You eat crusty bread and questionable cheese in a hallway while watching three dukes debate the spiritual meaning of asparagus. A maid snatches your plate before you finish. You smile anyway. Rule number 2. Always look grateful, even when you're chewing sadness. Then come the lessons. How to bow. Too deep, you're mocking them. Too shallow, you're challenging them. To a duel. Just right. You still look poor. How to stand. Always elegant. One hand resting gently on your dagger, for grace, not murder. Back straight, expression blank, emotions repressed. How to walk. Float. Don't stomp. Glide. Don't gallop. Absolutely no skipping. That's how you get exiled. You learn the 37 facial expressions of polite boredom. You learn to laugh without showing teeth. You learn to greet someone you hate like they're the godparent of your firstborn child. Everything is performance. You are no longer a person. You are a portrait, come to life. A breathing statue with opinions, but nowhere to place them. The worst sin in Versailles is sincerity. The second is smelling like a human. You fail several times. Once, you compliment a marquise on her wig. Turns out, she wasn't wearing one. Once, you mistake a prince for a butler. You spend the rest of the day scrubbing candle holders with a sock. Once, you sneeze near a duchess's dog. The duchess faints. The dog sues you. But you're still here. That means something. At Versailles, the sun sets slowly as if reluctant to leave such madness behind. The halls glow with candlelight. Powdered figures flit through corridors like ghosts. Someone plays a harpsichord. Someone else pretends to enjoy it. You return to your room. Gaston the rat is asleep on your pillow. Jacques snores. Olivier sobs quietly while brushing his wig. You lie there, staring at the ceiling, wondering what you've gotten yourself into. You miss your village. You miss fresh bread. You miss privacy. But as you close your eyes, one thought settles in. You haven't been dismissed. You haven't been noticed yet, but you haven't been dismissed. And in Versailles, that's the first sign of victory. A hush hung over the garden like dew, thick with the fragrance of damp earth and scattered jasmine. The lanterns had long since been lit, but their glow softened now, flickering like breath upon silk curtains that stirred with each timid sigh of the evening breeze. Somewhere deep in the palace, distant bells chimed softly, delicate, deliberate. It was neither a call nor a warning, merely time, passing like a procession of shadowed dancers. You had not yet slept. The silken mat beneath you was soft, perfumed faintly with sandalwood and worn from years of elegance, but no comfort could quell the echoing unrest within your chest. You had spent the hours since your ceremonial bath listening to the murmurs of the night, distant feet pacing marble floors, a solitary lute echoing through unseen halls, the whisper of someone weeping too softly to be heard, yet too near to ignore. You were no longer a girl of the village. That skin had shed itself with the soap and scrubs of the bathmaids. That name, the one your mother whispered into your ear every morning, had been washed away too. Here, you had no name unless it was gifted, and names were power currency, and Chains. Tonight was to be your first night in the harem proper. No more isolated room, no more instruction and ritual. You had been deemed ready. The madam, whose silken robes brushed silently through the air like a bird's wings, had given a single nod, no words, just the nod. Enough. And so here you sat, beneath layers of rose-dyed silk, on a cushion embroidered with cranes and winding rivers. Other girls passed occasionally through the far corridor, whispering in coded tones. Their gazes were not unkind, but they were curious, measuring some, perhaps, remembering their own first night. You were to serve tea to Lady Maria. They said she had once been the favorite years ago, when her skin still glowed with untroubled youth and her laughter hadn't yet turned brittle. But age had a way of turning favor into memory, and memory into regret. She was still treated with deference, but now her chamber was further from the emperor's. She no longer waited with the others on selection nights. She had become a keeper of stories and grudges, and it was said that she could see through silk and lies alike. You breathed deeply and rose. The tray before you held a pale ceramic teapot, 2 cups, a shallow dish of preserved kumquats, and a folded silk napkin. Your fingers trembled as you lifted it. The corridors bent like reeds, winding in curves of carved wood and hanging ferns. Painted fans hung from beams, their surfaces telling tales of falling kingdoms and phoenixes born from fire. You walked alone, for none were permitted to accompany you. This was a trial, an audience, a lesson. Lady Maria's door was half open. No one had touched it, but she had known you would come. Her chamber was dim, awash in lamplight, and perfumed with narcissus. She sat cross-legged on a low divan, her robe a dark garnet, her hair twisted with antique pins that had surely once known the emperor's touch. Her eyes were sharp, but her expression unreadable. "You are late," she said, though you were not. You bowed low and placed the tray before her with care. Your silence was your answer. She watched you pour the tea, hands shaking slightly despite your efforts. She said nothing of it. She took the cup and sipped once. "You think silence is wisdom. You were taught that," she murmured. "But in this place, silence can also be cowardice." You met her gaze, unsure if you were permitted to speak. She leaned back and smiled. It was not a kind smile. "The emperor does not love statues, girl. He adores masks. You must learn the difference." You nodded. She waved one delicate hand. "Remove your veil." You hesitated, then obeyed. The fabric slipped down your face like falling petals, baring your skin to the flickering lamplight. She examined you, not with lust or judgment, but with the meticulousness of a jeweler examining an imperfect stone. Soft, young, frightened. She clicked her tongue. "You won't last long unless you learn to sharpen the softness." Servant girl entered quietly behind you, collecting the tray and refilling the pot. Lady Maria leaned closer. "Do you know the story of Heian, the girl with willow eyes?" You shook your head. "She arrived like you, meek, pretty, sweet as almond milk. The emperor summoned her thrice in 1 week. On the 4th, she danced for him on a floor of mirrored gold. Her eyes glimmered. On the 5th, she fell from a balcony. You blinked. "Did she?" "She slipped," Maria said, voice dry. "So they said. Some slips are pushed, you see." The silence thickened again. "I am not warning you, child," she added. "I am reminding you. This place devours softness and jealousy, eats faster than rats." You swallowed hard. The air smelled too sweet, sickly. She gestured for you to pour another cup. "Tell me," she said at last, "why you think they chose you." You spoke, your voice trembling like wind chimes in winter. "They said, ... They said I looked like the moon." Lady Maria laughed a brittle, echoing laugh. "The moon, a curse in silk. Men chase her, and she burns them. Women fear her, and they banish her." She took another sip. "Perhaps they chose well." You did not know whether it was praise or prophecy. By the time you left her chamber, the corridor outside felt darker. The shadows seemed longer, their silence heavier. You made your way back in quiet footsteps, each one a heartbeat against the marble. The girls in the hallway no longer whispered, they watched. When you entered the bathing chamber to cleanse once more, the senior maid said nothing as she unbound your hair and began to brush it. Her fingers were gentler than they had been earlier. Perhaps that was pity, perhaps approval. You still didn't know, as you returned to your sleeping quarters. The moon had risen high, silver and round, watching from a small carved window. You looked up at her, wondering if she too had once served tea, and smiled through trembling. No one had told you what the next day would bring, but you understood now that your arrival had ended, that the real beginning in written, coiled in the shadows, like a serpent had already begun, and you would not sleep tonight either. The moon, now waxed and high, peered over the ridge of slanted wooden roofs, like a silent judge watching the sins of the night unfold. Wind pressed its palm flat against the wooden shutters, whistling like a thief caught in the middle of a prayer. And within that little corner of the brothel, the room that had neither lock, nor curtain, nor claimed to silence, the new girl sat in silence, yet to sleep. She had washed again, not because she needed to, but because the scent of men from earlier still clung to her, like the sticky residue of spoiled honey. The low burning coals in the corner brazier painted her skin in flickering orange tones, outlining her ribs, her neck, the inner part of her thighs. It was not cold, but the air carried a certain rawness, a reminder that the night had not yet ended. "Get used to it," whispered one of the older girls, while passing by her open door. "It's quieter at night, but it gets no kinder." She did not reply. There were no words to give. Her fingers traced the hem of the small linen wrap she wore. That same wrap which earlier had been yanked aside, untied, and abandoned on the floor by a merchant with too much wine on his breath. He had left laughing, tossing a silver coin on her chest as if she were a tray. The coin still lay on the shelf where she had placed it, untouched. She didn't yet know whether to keep it or hate it. From beyond her room came the soft clink of bottles, the rustle of skirts, the distant rhythm of a lute being tuned out of tune by a blind musician downstairs. The house never truly slept. The walls breathed, the floorboards sighed, and those who worked within them, girls, women, broken daughters, sharp-headed crones, they did not dream. They remembered she had been in this brothel for only one full day, and already her legs bore witness to stories she wouldn't speak. Yet her eyes, tired as they were, still held a strange gleam. Not defiance, no, that had been pressed out of her earlier, with a slap and a rough grip to the jaw, but a stubborn sort of silence. A secret she hadn't told yet. In the hallway, Mira appeared. The same Mira who had pulled her aside earlier in the day to explain how the bed should be made quickly between clients. The same Mira who tucked herbs under her tongue to hide the scent of wine. She stood now with her shawl wrapped tightly, peering into the girl's room like someone checking if a storm had passed. "No clients for you tonight," she said softly. "You've done enough." "Is that kindness?" the girl asked. Mira looked surprised. "It's math. You've made enough coin today for Madame to be pleased. She doesn't like new girls to warn on their first week. Ruins the shape." The girl said nothing. Mira lingered. She was older, 20 maybe, which here made her a veteran. Her arms were stronger, her jaw more angular. But there was tenderness in the way she leaned against the doorframe. "You eat?" Mira asked. "I wasn't told to." "You don't need to be told. You need to live." She stepped inside and placed a small bowl on the wooden stool by the bed. Thick lentil broth with strips of last night's bread. Not warm, but not yet cold. The girl stared at it. "I'll come back later," Mira said, turning to leave. "You can cry if you need to, but do it quick. They don't like swollen faces." The door creaked shut again, and for a moment, silence returned. She did not cry, but she reached for the spoon. The broth tasted of cumin and smoke. It reminded her faintly of home. Not her real home, not the place with the tall fence and the overbearing ant, but of the one she imagined. The one in her mind, a cottage, where women didn't have to smile on command, where doors were locked from the inside, where the price of a meal wasn't her body. The moon moved, the night pressed forward below. The brothel's main room hummed with lower voices, now wealthier clients who came late and paid more for privacy. Somewhere a bottle shattered. Somewhere a girl laughed too loudly and too falsely. She stood from her bed, slowly. Her muscles ached, but her mind was sharper now. She peeked through the door and stepped into the hallway. The scent of wine, oil, and fading perfume clung to the plastered walls. She passed other rooms, one with soft gasps, another with a girl softly humming to herself as she brushed her tangled hair. They all knew she was new. She could feel it in their eyes. Some pitied, some watched, some waited for her to break. At the end of the hallway, there was a narrow door, half open, leading to the rear stairs. Mira had mentioned it in passing. Don't go up there unless you're called. That's Madame's floor. But the girl climbed, barefoot and silent. Each wooden step creaked differently. A few groaned under her slight weight. The staircase ended at a heavy door, decorated with carved roses, now dulled by age and smoke. She didn't knock. She only listened. Inside, she could hear voices. A man's voice, low and businesslike, and Madame's sharp, nasal, precise, like a knife being polished. They weren't speaking of pleasure. They were speaking of prices. She's young, Madame said, but not stupid. She'll last if she learns fast. How much for a month? Exclusive, the man asked. Too soon. Let her finish the week. I don't like men who rush. You always say that. It's because it's always true. The girl stepped back. Not from fear, but from understanding. She was a name not yet spoken but already counted. She returned to her room quietly, her mind full of numbers, dates, calculations. There would be others. Rich men with preferences. Gentle ones, perhaps. Brutal ones, surely. Madame would test which kind she survived best. She picked up the silver coin at last and tucked it under her pillow. She was no longer the girl who had arrived yesterday. She was becoming someone else, and that someone, whoever she would be, would know how to listen at doors, how to walk on creaking stairs, how to take broth without a thank you, how to earn rest without waiting for permission. Outside, the wind died down. Inside, she folded herself into the blanket, not to sleep, but to prepare, because tomorrow she would learn who came next, and whether they came for her body or for what was growing behind her eyes. A soft hush fell over the inner chambers, as morning did not rise, but rather lingered in quiet defiance beyond the sealed stone walls. Down here, beneath the waking world, time moved, like dripping wax, slow, thick, unbothered by sun or sky, and, in that unchanging gloom, life of another rhythm unfolded. One soft step, one muffled laugh, one heated whisper at a time. Alina stirred again, not from noise, for the dungeon kept most sounds at bay, but from the ache in her limbs. It was not pain that woke her, not fear either. It was simply the body, remembering that it lived, that it had been used, stretched, whispered to, leaned on. She blinked into the flickering candlelight as the narrow corridor beyond her chamber hummed softly with shuffling feet and distant wooden creaks. She rolled her shoulders slowly, as one might roll a secret across the tongue. The mattress was no bed of luxury, but her muscles had sunk into it through the hours. Her breath was warm against the linen. She stretched a leg toward the edge where the floor's chill licked up like a curious cat, just beyond the cloth divider. Muted voices began their morning dances, laughter, through fatigue, murmured tales of lords who never returned, and girls, comparing marks upon skin, as though they were medals from a silent war. The red-haired girl with the sharp tongue, Danica, hummed as she braided her hair into spirals that coiled like ivy. No one truly knew what time it was. That notion had left the brothel the moment the gates sealed behind them all. Here, there, were only bells. Bells that summoned, bells that released, bells that warned. A slow chime came low, dragging, like iron on stone. Time for the washing. Someone whispered, not to her, but near enough for Alina to hear. She stepped out onto the cold stone, feet bare. Her white shift clung to her knees like mist. Down the corridor, one by one, the girls made their way toward the bath chamber. That room was deeper in the dungeon, tucked behind an arched doorway where water from the spring below the castle had been trapped in hollowed marble. The bath was steam-thick when Alina entered. Pale bodies moved through mist like ghosts, some laughing, others silently scrubbing at their skin, like it held sorrow that wouldn't lift. An older woman named Branka poured herbal oils into the water, her hands cracked but strong. She had once been like them, they said. She had once danced behind velvet curtains, too. Now she healed bruises and cut hair. Alina slid into the warmth and let it draw a shiver from her ribs. Steam loosened the knots in her back, and the scent of rosemary settled over her like a prayer. She said nothing, though Danica eventually came near and nudged her foot with her own. "Not bad for a first night," she murmured, twirling a wet strand of her hair. "You looked like a deer, but you held your ground. Not everyone does." Alina gave a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Did you think of running?" Alina shook her head. "Running where? There are no doors." Danica chuckled. "Some. Still try that girl 2 months ago, Celis. Remember her? She climbed up the waste chute. They found her in the sewer tunnels 2 days later, near blind and half mad from the dark. And still, Lord Andre sent her back in a ribbon. A ribbon." Danica lifted a brow, wrapped around her wrist like a gift. He liked the poetry of it. Alina's stomach turned, though she masked it quickly. There was no room for softness here. The walls would absorb it and spit it back out as weakness. One had to be iron wrapped in velvet. As the bath drained, Branka passed out dry cloths and oils. Alina rubbed the blend into her arms slowly, marveling at the oddness of it being pampered like royalty in a place meant for the discarded. There was a theater to it all. The brothel wanted its girls to glow, to smell like warmth and mystery, to look like silk-clad temptation. Yet beneath it all, they were still captives, beautified prisoners. Dressed again, they returned to their chambers. The beds had been remade by silent women in gray aprons maids, who never looked anyone in the eye and whispered only to each other in a tongue none of the girls knew. They moved like smoke and vanished just as fast. A silver tray had been left for Alina, containing bread, figs, and a cup of some warm milky brew. She sipped it without question. Hunger and habit left little room for doubt. Then came the knock, soft, deliberate. She froze. It was too early for the next bell. Danica's voice floated from the corridor. "Don't worry, not a patron. That's Talia." Alina opened the door slowly. Talia stood poised with a bundle in her arms. She was older than the rest, perhaps by a decade, with a grace that made her seem carved from polished wood. Her gown was darker, her neckline higher, her belt lined with keys. Authority cloaked her shoulders like a second skin. "I'm to show you the library chamber today," she said. "You can read, can't you?" Alina nodded cautiously. "Good, come." Down they went, past corridors lined with oil lamps, past a room filled with silks and perfumes, through a hall that smelled of lemon and old parchment. At last, they entered a small round chamber lit by high-grated windows. A desk sat in the center, surrounded by shelves not of books, but of ledgers, scrolls, contracts. "This is where we keep the names," Talia said, gesturing toward a large bound tome with red stitching, "of patrons, of girls, of deals. It's important you understand the politics of this place." Alina's fingers brushed the leather cover of the ledger. The name at the top of the page made her breath hitch. She said nothing, but Talia noticed. "You'll see many names you recognize. This brothel is not for peasants or drunks. It's for the powerful, lords, ambassadors, bishops in traveling cloaks. We serve pleasure, yes, but more than that, we serve secrets." Alina looked up, startled. Talia nodded. "Every night is a confession. every pleasure, a truth. And you are both witness and priest. She closed the ledger. Learn well. Listen better. Your body is not your only weapon here. Your memory will keep you alive longer than your beauty. With that, she turned and left Alina alone with the room of parchment and iron keys. She stood, in silence, heart steady now. There would be no escape, but there would be knowledge. And in knowledge, perhaps eventually power. A soft draft swept through the stones. Carrying the scent of wax and something older still, she sat at the desk and began to read. The fire crackled low in the corner of the chamber, its amber glow dancing gently across the stone walls like warm silk. Outside, the hush of twilight lingered in the air, and the distant chirping of crickets gave rhythm to the soft pulse of the night. A gentle breeze drifted through the slatted wooden windows, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine and something deeper, something like longing. You sat on the lacquered bench near the polished mirror, the same mirror that had witnessed the stillness of your evenings since your arrival. Your robe was draped lightly across your shoulders, a gossamer fabric that shimmered faintly in the dim light. An attendant quietly combed through your hair with ivory fingers, her touch steady, unhurried. Each stroke of the comb brought not just order, but a feeling of quiet ritual, as if the night itself required a kind of reverence. In the corridors beyond, slippers whispered across smooth floors. Somewhere down the hall, laughter rose softly, brief, melodic, and then disappeared again, like a ripple in a silent pond. You were not needed tonight in the Emperor's chambers. It was neither your night of duty nor a night of selection. Tonight belonged to no one, and so, in that rare pocket of unclaimed time, you were free to simply exist, to breathe, to remember. You turned slightly toward the mirror. The woman staring back at you had grown unfamiliar, not in face, but in gaze. Her eyes had softened, her spine had lengthened, her mouth no longer held the hard line of uncertainty. You wondered if she resembled the girl who had first arrived here fresh from the dust and clamor of the provinces, unsure of how to walk, how to bow, how to breathe in such carefully arranged silence. That girl had trembled in her slippers. This woman now carried her silence like silk. You rose slowly from the bench and stepped toward the open lattice window. Lanterns floated in the central courtyard like sleepy stars, their light pooling in golden puddles on the marble. Somewhere below, a musician played a guzheng, the notes light and melancholy, like rain falling on petals. The song clung to the air like breath on cold glass, fragile, fleeting. True. The attendant had left quietly, as they always did. You stood alone now, palms resting on the wooden sill, the night drawing close around your shoulders like a shawl. You had learned so much, not from books, not from scrolls, but from silences, from watching how the higher-ranking consorts never turned their heads too quickly, how they laughed with restraint, how their words curved like painted fans, never sharp, never careless. You had learned how to wait, how to speak with your eyes, when your lips must remain still, how to survive in a world where every smile bore a secret. And yet, despite everything, there was beauty, the kind of beauty that only those confined within walls come to truly notice: the shape of shadows on wooden screens, the precise folding of a robe, the reflection of moonlight on black lacquered floors. Here, beauty was not just seen, it was performed, inhaled, endured. You reached for a pale plum from the tray beside your bed, turning it slowly in your hand. The fruit was cool, its skin taut. You bit into it gently. Sweetness bloomed on your tongue, followed by a whisper of tartness. You chewed slowly, letting the taste fill the quiet. That was how everything must be done here, gently, gracefully, as if the world were made of glass. The door creaked softly behind you, and you turned. Another attendant stepped in, bowing low, her hands clasped before her. "The Lady Wei invites you to join her in the southern pavilion," she said, voice low, respectful. Lady Wei. one of the senior concubines, not the most favored, but close enough to the sun to be warm, and far enough to still remember the shade. Her invitations were rare, deliberate. You nodded slowly, and stood, brushing invisible dust from your robe. You followed the attendant down the silent corridor. The floors gleamed beneath your feet. The silence here was thick, purposeful, a silence that guarded secrets like pearls in velvet. As you walked, your mind drifted again, not to home, but to the rhythms of this place, to the shape your life had taken in the months since your arrival, how it had folded itself, gently but irrevocably, into the rhythm of the palace. Lady Wei was waiting under a cherry-wood pergola, her face lit by the soft glow of a lantern. She gestured for you to sit beside her on the cushioned bench. The pond before you reflected the moon in gentle ripples. "I hear your embroidery has reached the dowager herself," she said softly, sipping from a cup of chrysanthemum tea. "That is not a small thing." You bowed slightly. "I only do what I'm taught," she smiled faintly. "We all do. But some of us learn faster." There was no threat in her voice, only observation. She turned to look at the pond. The emperor notices those who move like water, graceful, quiet, but constant. You sat beside her in thoughtful silence. The conversation was light, but every word held weight. She was testing you, weighing you not with hostility, but with careful interest. And you knew then, this was not a warning, it was an offering. You walked back to your chambers later that night, under a sky full of stars. The garden path was lined with quiet lanterns, the scent of sweet osmanthus hanging in the air. Your robe fluttered around your ankles, and your fingers brushed against the silk pouch tied at your waist. When you reached your room, you found the comb still lying on the bench, half glimpsed in the moonlight. You sat again before the mirror. You didn't need the comb now, nor the attendant. You took the comb into your own hand and slowly pulled it through your hair, one stroke at a time. Outside, the night deepened. The palace sighed in its sleep, and you sat still, as you always did, but something in you had shifted. A stone dropped into the still pool of your heart. Not heavy, not sudden, just enough to ripple. Tomorrow might bring another summons, or it might bring silence. Either way, you were ready. The night returned, slowly, like a shadow easing into the corners of the earth. It came not with a roar, but with whispers, soft hushes that danced between the wooden beams of the brothel, slid beneath the velvet curtains, and clung to the silk robes worn by those who lived behind closed doors. For the women of the house, it was not just another evening. It was another ceremony of survival, of performance, of blending into the desires of men while preserving fragments of their souls in quiet rebellion. She sat at her vanity in the dim light of the flickering oil lamp, the scent of jasmine oil soaked into her skin. The mirror reflected not the girl she once was, but the geisha they had shaped her into, eyes lowered, lips painted, gestures memorized until they became instinct. Her name, the real one, was buried beneath layers of stagecraft and subtle submission. What remained was the name they had given Hertha, one that echoed through the hallways. When clients requested her specifically, tonight, her obi was tied with extra care. The madam had arranged a meeting with someone of higher stature than you, wealthy merchant from Kyoto, rumored to have dealings with samurai lords and men of power. He was not one of the usual drunkards seeking escape. He had wealth, status, and a sharpness in his eye that would require more than practiced smiles and delicate bows. She walked silently through the corridor, feet wrapped in soft socks, her geta left behind near the wooden threshold. Outside, the cicadas hummed their ancient lullaby, a reminder that the world beyond these walls lived and breathed under the same stars. But here, behind paper screens and perfumed incense, another world unfolded, one ruled by etiquette, by subtle glances, by silence and allure. The merchant sat on the cushion with his back straight, his posture like a blade. His robe was silk, and his eyes did not wander the way others did. He watched her enter as one would observe a delicate game of Go, assessing each step for strategy. She bowed, slow and fluid, her eyes never quite meeting his, as was custom. He said nothing at first, only motioned for the servants to leave. The room closed in around them, quiet, warm, intimate. She poured the psyche with elegance, her wrists turned just so, her sleeve brushing the air like a swan's wing. Still, he did not speak. Only after 3 full sips did he break the silence. "You were not born to this place," he said, voice like wind scraping stone. She did not answer. That, too, was custom. "Your eyes betray you," he continued, sipping again. "They are too wild, too awake." She smiled softly, a practiced curl of her lips. "It is the makeup, perhaps." He gave a low hum, somewhere between amusement and warning. "You have not yet learned to sleep while awake. That takes time." His words lodged in her chest. She had heard many things from men, boasts, poetry, drunken songs, but rarely had one spoken so plainly of the truth. She poured. Again, slower this time. In the stillness, he reached into his sleeve and retrieved a fan, opening it with a flick. The design was simple black ink waves crashing over a silver moon. "You will meet men," he said, "who believe they own you with coins and silk, who think your silence is weakness. But silence, when used well, is a weapon." She dared to look up, just slightly. His face was unreadable. "You are not ready to leave this place," he added, "but one day you might be, if you can learn which parts of yourself to bury and which to protect." The words hung in the air like incense smoke, curling into the corners of her mind. He stood then, far earlier than most clients would. He bowed slightly, not the casual nod of superiority, but a deliberate gesture of equal respect. And then, he left. No touch, no command, only the echo of his sandals fading down the polished hallway. She sat in the silence he left behind, unsure of whether she had just entertained a customer or received a warning. That night, as the house settled into its soft rituals, the laughter, the rustle of robes, the thrum of shamisen strings, she remained awake longer than most. She untied her obi with trembling hands, her mind replaying the merchant's words. Was there still something unbroken in her? Something wild, like he had said? In the garden beyond her window, a bamboo stalk creaked gently in the wind, tall and bending but never breaking. She watched it sway, and thought of her mother's stories of wind spirits and foxes who took human form. Tricksters, yes, but also survivors. She wondered idly if the merchant had seen a fox in her that night. Down the hallway, another girl cried softly behind her curtain. Perhaps a new one, not yet trained in how to weep without sound. In this house, tears were not forbidden, only unseen. She closed her eyes and imagined herself stepping out the gate, her feet in sandals, her name, her own again. The vision shimmered and broke like heat on stone. The days blurred after that, folding into one another like lacquered pages of a story retold too often. She danced, she poured, she laughed. She whispered poems into ears of drunk poets, and listened to the drunkenness of failed warriors. She memorized the language of hands, the softness in sighs, the tremor and laughter that meant a man would pay extra to be told he was strong. But inside, a shift had begun. Quiet, almost invisible, she began to watch the madam more closely, how she moved, how she negotiated. She noted the guards' routines. She memorized the creaks in the floorboards, the loosest panel near the back storage room. Not for escape, not yet, but for understanding, for knowing. Late one night, as rain tapped gently on the roof tiles, she sat with her closest companion, an older girl named Hannah, who had trained her in the early days. Hannah's face was soft and lined, beautiful in a quiet, worn way. "Do you ever think of leaving?" she asked, her voice barely more than breath. Hannah laughed softly. Every day. And why don't you? Because leaving means surviving out there alone. And surviving alone means you might forget who you ever were. Silence followed. Heavy, real. But, Hannah added, if you can remember, even in secret who you are, what you were before then, maybe you won't be lost, no matter how long you stay. That night, she wrapped her hair in silk and lay down on the tatami, heart beating slowly. She clutched the corner of her pillow and whispered her real name into the folds of the fabric, as she did every night now. Not for anyone else to hear, but for herself. Just to know it still existed, even if only in shadows. And so, the nights went on, but she had begun to change. The girl they thought they had shaped into an ornament was listening, watching, and waiting. The moon had passed its zenith, casting silver shadows that stretched long and restless through the narrow alleyways of the ancient city, in the hidden heart of the imperial residence, where the scent of jasmine mingled with the faint perfume of sandalwood. The silence was not so much a stillness as it was a presence quiet, alert, and humming with secrets. Ayaka sat beneath the open lattice of the painted screen, where moonlight painted soft lines across her folded hands. Her eyes, half lowered in faint meditation, watched the shifting shape of her thoughts as they moved like dancers through the palace corridors of her mind. Tonight. The corridors beyond her chamber echoed faintly with footsteps that were not the eunuchs or the trusted concubines. Something in the wind had shifted. Whispers had floated through the silk partitions that morning of a foreign envoy who had arrived with scrolls bound in red lacquer, of a dispute among the court scribes, of the empress's silence behind her golden veil. Ayaka had learned to listen between words and beneath gestures, to catch the weight of a glance or the meaning in a servant's tightened grip. Her own standing, though stable, was fragile. She had not yet climbed into the emperor's favored hours in over a week, not since the night of the willow garden, when her words had stirred in him laughter, but no summons had followed. She lived each day in the subtle contest of presence without pleading, grace without grasping. It was the way of the palace silent battles, fought in glances. Power traded like incense smoke, rising and dissolving. The morning had been filled with preparations, though none were spoken aloud. Fabric rustled in the tailoring hall. Flowers were arranged and rearranged. A foreign scent had lingered in the halls, sharp and unfamiliar. Ayaka had watched from the shadows as Lady Tomo passed, her silken robes trimmed in black and silver, a sign of mourning or menace. Perhaps both. Ayaka had risen early that day. The heat of summer had not yet lifted, and the stone floor felt cool beneath her bare feet. She had taken her tea without honey, her hunger dulled by anticipation. A new girl had been added to the concubines' ranks, a girl from the western provinces, with hair the color of dusk and a voice like trembling strings. The others whispered about her, but Ayaka had withheld judgment. She remembered her own arrival, the wide-eyed uncertainty, the painful elegance expected too soon. This girl, too, would learn the language of survival, of silence and softness. That afternoon, Ayaka had been summoned to the southern pavilion not by name, but by the ripple of motion through the garden path. When she arrived, she found not the emperor, but his mother, the dowager empress, seated beneath a canopy of silk, her face nearly hidden by an ornate fan carved with dragons and peonies. She regarded Ayaka with eyes that shimmered like polished obsidian. "You are not as loud as the others," she said, her voice papery and dry. "That is not always a virtue." Ayaka bowed deeply, knowing that every response was a test, nor always a flaw. "Great lady." The fan paused, a small nod. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at the emperor?" Ayaka remained still. The question was barbed. "I see a man of weight and wind, constant, yet changing. One must learn the sky to read him." "Poetry," the empress murmured. "You were trained in the northern school." "Yes. They teach loyalty as obedience, not as strategy. A pause. I serve with both. Another silence. Then the fan moved again, dismissively. You may go. But Ayaka knew better. The visit was not an invitation, it was a warning. Perhaps the Empress had grown weary of the Western girl's rise. Perhaps Ayaka herself had drifted too near the center. In the palace, favor and danger were twins. She spent the evening in the garden, kneeling at the edge of the koi pond, watching the ripples as if they might reveal something. The night insects murmured in the underbrush, and lanterns swayed gently in the breeze. Her fingers moved absent-mindedly along the edge of her fan, tracing a pattern of leaves and clouds. She was not safe, not yet, but she was not lost either. In the quietness of twilight, she rehearsed the art of existing just beyond desire, of remaining beautiful without seeming to try, of offering her voice like a reed, flute heard only when the wind required it. That night, just after the candles had been snuffed and the moon rose like a pearl in the sky, a quiet knock came at her door. It was a servant she did not recognize, young, pale eyes wide with urgency. The Emperor, he whispered, requests your presence. She did not move at first. Then, slowly, she rose. The chambermaids stirred like moths from the shadows, dressing her not in crimson or emerald, but in a robe of pale indigo silk, threaded with gold. Her hair was left partially unbundled, like a poem not yet finished. As she was led through the corridors, the hush of midnight enfolded her. The silence of the palace was never completed, was a tension, like the moment before a musician draws the bow. And in that silence, Ayaka understood. Tonight was not about pleasure. It was about position, influence, rebalancing. The Emperor awaited her not in the central chamber, but in the Tower of Plum Blossoms, where political decisions often passed disguised as poetry readings. When she entered, he was seated by the window, overlooking the lantern-lit courtyard below. He did not look at her immediately. I have been thinking, he said, about the sky. She waited. It shifts even when we do not notice. And we, like insects, move beneath it, some frantic, some slow. She stepped closer, her feet soundless against the polished wood, but even insects are drawn to the moon. At that, he turned, his expression unreadable. Come, he said simply, and so she did, quiet as a whisper, graceful as a falling petal. She crossed the threshold into the dim glow of imperial decision. Tonight, Ayaka would not be simply a concubine. She would be a whisper in the Emperor's thoughts, an influence nestled behind the veil of his intentions. Her survival would be sealed, not with beauty, but with timing, knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to leave silence heavy in the air. The moonlight caught the edge of her robe as she knelt beside him, and far below, in the gardens, forgotten by the world, the plum blossoms stirred, fragrant and unseen. The sky above the capital deepened into a velvet dusk, yet the palace never truly slept. Beneath lanterns flickering with amber light, and within courtyards laced with silent wind chimes, life unfurled, softly hidden, patient and watchful, as the sun's final breath melted into indigo. The women of the inner quarters moved like slow rivers, their robes whispering with the scent of jasmine and long-kept secrets. Kaoru's eyes opened slowly, her lashes fluttering like the wings of a moth against her cheeks. The air was cool on her skin, the kind of cool that signaled deep night, the hour when thoughts stirred from their cages and memories moved without permission. She sat upright, the silken futon slipping from her shoulder, revealing a slender arm marked with faint warmth from where she'd lain beside the shogun. He was still asleep, his face in repose, seemed carved from silence itself. The same man who commanded armies, with a look now breathed evenly beside her, as if time too had laid down its sword. Kaoru watched him not with longing, but with a kind of muted reverence, as though watching a distant mountain she'd climbed once and would never climb again. She rose. Bare feet touched tatami. The floor was chilled, but comforting, like earth after rain. She wrapped herself in her plain outer robe, one of linen, not silk, preferring its honesty. Sliding open the panel screen, she stepped into the corridor. There, the world greeted her with a hush, the faint rustle of bamboo, the echo of a guard's footstep far below, and a breeze carrying pine and plum blossom like drifting smoke. I was waiting. The old maid always knew. Perhaps she never truly slept. She offered a bow and a cup of warm barley tea, its steam curling like old prayers. Together, they walked the length of the veranda, two shadows joined in silence, until they reached the garden tucked deep behind. The western wing. No one else came here this late. Moonlight filtered through the trees, layering Kaoru's face in silver. The koi pond shimmered. The stones were still warm with memory. She sat by the water, brushing her fingers just above its surface. Ripples, scattered like scattered thoughts. Too many, too soft to hold. Yuki remained behind her, quiet as always. Then, at last, she spoke. He dreams of fire again, doesn't he? Kaoru did not answer, but her stillness was enough. The shogun's dreams had become darker of late. His restlessness did not touch her body as much as it touched the air between them. It pulsed like a second heart, invisible but ever present. The court has shifted, Yuki added, her voice low. There are whispers about the envoy and Lady Hannah. Kaoru did not flinch. Of course she had heard. The envoy from the North Province had arrived 3 days ago, bearing tribute and riddles. With him came Lady Hannah draped in brocade and the scent of ambition. Her laughter lingered too long in the corridors. Her gaze lingered even longer on the shogun, and yet Kaoru felt no jealousy. Hannah was a mask, a role in a play they'd all rehearsed. Kaoru, however, was the silence between the lines. She had become the space where the shogun could simply be a mirror that did not reflect power or politics, but breath and bone. She had been taught from the start, a concubine is not a wife, not a mother, not a rival. She is wind on the skin, present, passing, unforgettable. Still, the game was changing. By morning. The palace would stir with rumors. Servants would bow lower. Ministers would raise eyebrows. Alliances would twist like vines toward new sunlight. Kaoru knew the rhythm. She had danced to its beat before. But tonight, in the stillness before dawn, she let herself forget all of it. She dipped her feet into the pond. The water welcomed her with a soft embrace. A koi brushed past her toe. Somewhere overhead, a night bird cried. I remember, Kaoru murmured, almost to herself, the first night I came here. I thought I was being gifted. But it was me who had to give. Yuki bowed her head. You gave more than they ever deserved, she whispered. They sat in silence, past the turning of the hour, when the horizon finally softened a smudging. With the first breath of light, Kaoru stood. She walked back alone, her bare feet silent on the wood. The chamber was still dark when she re-entered, but the shogun stirred. Kaoru, he murmured. She slipped beside him, drawing the futon over them both. He reached for her without opening his eyes, a hand brushing against her collarbone as if confirming her presence, not possession. Just comfort. I dreamt you left, he whispered. Kaoru pressed her forehead to his. I won't leave until the wind stops blowing, she said. And for now, the wind still moved. The moon had waned since she last felt the hush of solitude. Nights had grown heavier, not darker, but slower, as though the silence itself was weighed down by breathless expectation. In the garden where lanterns once danced like fireflies upon strings of jasmine, she now walked barefoot, the soil still warm from the sun, the wind whispering the names of women before her. She could feel them, shadows tucked into the creases of history, watching her, steady and still, like painted eyes in old silk screens. She was no longer a newcomer. The palace no longer startled her. She knew the exact creak of the wooden slats beneath the paper walls of the southern corridor. Knew how the scent of cedar clung to Lord Hayato's robes before he ever entered a room, and how the low murmur of court women changed pitch when she passed by, like the rustle of reeds anticipating wind. They had begun to fold their whispers more tightly now, not because they feared her, but because they recognized the shift. She had not risen by luck, nor charm. She had listened, watched, bent, but never broke. She offered warmth when warmth was needed, stillness when stillness was required, and words only when they tasted like the tea Lord Hayato favored, earthy, delicate, and lingering on the tongue. Tonight, she sat beside the lacquered brazier, its faint glow tracing the curve of her wrist and jaw. Her robe was ink-black, stitched with silver cranes that seemed to drift across her body as she moved. Her hair had been perfumed with camellia oil and swept into a knot, a single ivory pin piercing it like a moonbeam through silk. The summons had come with no fanfare. A silent boy in the uniform of the inner court had approached her chamber, bowed low, and extended a folded parchment bound with red thread. She did not unfold it. She did not need to. She had sensed it before it arrived. Lord Hayato desired her presence. By now she knew the rituals well. The slow disrobing of tension, the careful sips of spiced sake, the way the room changed the moment he entered, how the air grew taut, like the silence before a string is plucked. He was not unkind, but he was precise, measured, a man who did not tolerate ripples where stillness was demanded. He was already seated when she arrived, his gaze drawn to the ink painting on the far wall, where a crane bowed toward a stream. The candlelight pooled around him, carving the sharp lines of his cheekbones, glinting in his eyes like shards of obsidian. He did not turn, not immediately. He rarely turned too quickly. He preferred others to orbit him, to find their rhythm within his gravity. "You did not look at the parchment," he finally said, voice low, more a current than a sound. She bowed. "Your call is never unexpected, my lord." He turned now, his eyes taking her in, not as a man examines a woman, but as a craftsman examines fine jade, flawless, if only for a fleeting season. "You have changed," he said. "I have learned," she answered. He rose, stepping closer. His fingers brushed the crane embroidered over her shoulder. "And what have you learned?" She did not flinch. That even cranes, though made for the sky, bow low when the wind commands it. He studied her a moment longer, then let out a breath that was nearly a laugh. "You speak like the old poets." She did not smile, but her eyes glinted. "And yet I am still here, breathing new verses into old halls." There was a silence between them, rich and layered. A silence filled, not with distance, but with the quiet proximity of two who understood their roles with deadly precision. She moved to pour the tea, hand steady, sleeves whispering against the lacquered table. He watched her without blinking. "Do they fear you now?" he asked suddenly. She paused. "Some do. And do you enjoy that?" She placed the teacup before him. "I prefer understanding to fear, but fear is useful where understanding refuses to bloom." He took the cup and drank deeply. Outside, a cicada cried out. Another joined, then another, until the garden was filled with a rising hummaz, though nature itself recognized the shift in power. That night, he did not touch her. He simply sat beside her, speaking of provinces, of changing tides in court, of the empress's failing health, and the whispers that curled like incense around the future. She listened, offering little, asking less. Her presence alone a balm against the fraying edges of his empire, and when he dismissed her, hours later, there was no fanfare, no silk sash gifted, no perfume bestowed, just a silent nod and the knowledge that her place had solidified in stone, not merely in silk. She stepped into the corridor, the night cloaking her like a second robe. The palace was not asleep, never truly slept, but it held its breath as she walked. Even the shadows seemed to part before her, as if unsure of whether to greet her or fear her dot in her chamber. She removed the robe with slow reverence, folding it over the wooden rack as though it were armor. Her hand lingered on the silver cranes. She looked at her reflection in the polished bronze mirror knot, as a woman vain of beauty. But as a tactician studying a map, she saw the quiet in her gaze, the certainty, the promise. The other women still played their games, circling favors, trading silks and secrets, trying to guess the shape of the Lord's next desire. But she had learned that desire, true desire, was not loud. It was not red lips and laughter, echoing down halls. It was quiet, intentional, a hand placed exactly where it needed to be, a word spoken when silence is more valuable. And she had become his silence. Outside, the wind moved through the bamboo, brushing against the walls like the hem of a departing spirit. She sat by the screen, her silhouette framed in moonlight, eyes open, still. Tomorrow, she knew, new rumors would stir. The Empress's cousin had arrived from the north. The concubine with the rose-colored robes had wept openly in the corridor. The garden gate had remained open past the evening bell. But she would not chase any of it. She would wait, as the crane waits at the edge of the lake, perfectly still, perfectly poised, until the water itself comes to bow before it. The rains had not stopped for 2 days now. The gray curtains of heaven fell endlessly upon the rooftops of the inner city, washing the courtyards and cobbled alleys in a thin sheet of silver. The wooden beams of the brothel's upper gallery creaked under the weight of it, and inside, behind the beaded curtains and oil lanterns, the air had grown thick with the scent of wet silk, burning sandalwood, and memories that would soon belong to no one. She sat alone by the window now, her hair unbound, her body draped in the crimson robe given to her by the matron on her first evening. Time had wrinkled its edges, faded the threads, but still it clung to her like the warmth of old affection. Her name had become legend behind these walls. The younger girls, eager and uncertain, whispered her stories in corners, mimicked her walk, sought her gaze for reassurance, and the older ones, well, even they now bowed their heads when she passed. But she was tired, not in her bone stows, still held strengths but in her heart, that quiet ache behind the breast that no physician could diagnose. She had mastered every curve of desire, memorized the art of folding her sorrow into the curl of a smile, but she had not yet learned how to say goodbye until today. The scroll had arrived in the morning, rolled tightly, sealed in black lacquer. The calligraphy was familiar, precise, elegant, cruel in its restraint. It was from the governor's wife. No words of thanks, no apologies, just a decree, signed and stamped, "You are released." The words stared back at her, more terrifying than chains. What did it mean to be free, after a decade of living within silk walls and shadowed rules? What did it mean to walk through the city as no one, when she had lived for so long as someone else? Rain tapped against the wooden panes like a soft knock. She rose. Her feet kissed the lacquered floor softly, steps slow, reverent. She passed through the corridors, where once she had laughed, where once she had wept. The rooms, once glowing with candlelight and sighs, now seemed quieter, perhaps in mourning for her departure. She stopped at the matron's door. It was open. The old woman was seated cross-legged, counting coins into silk pouches with the same precision she had 20 years ago. Her hair had silvered completely, her spine more hunched, but her eyes still held that feral spark, the gaze of a woman who built empires from other women's pain. "You're leaving?" the matron said, without looking up. "I am. Where? Will you go?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped inside, knelt, and bowed low, not as a servant, not as a prisoner, but as a daughter, giving thanks to a cruel, kind mother. The matron placed a coin in the final pouch and tied it shut. "You'll be remembered," she murmured. "No," she said, lifting her face. "That's not what I want." And she stood, taking nothing but the robe on her back and the memory of songs once sung on late summer nights. Asterisk, asterisk, the city beyond the brothel's threshold felt colder than she remembered. Not the weather, but the people. Men huddled beneath umbrellas. rushing past her with no glances. Women pulled their children close. Carriages rumbled down the street, wheels splashing through puddles without pause. She walked unnoticed, a ghost among the living, and perhaps that was how it should be. Her beauty had once commanded attention, silenced rooms, seduced kings, but now, she wanted only the silence. She crossed the stone bridge above the river, pausing, to watch the waters below churn and writhe with the season's rain. The ribbons she had once tied into lovers' hair, the letters she had burned in secret, all of it seemed to float in that water gone now, swallowed by the years. She pressed a small paper into the cracks of the bridge wall, a note she had written that morning. It read, "Not everything that blooms must be seen," and she walked on. That evening, the sky cleared. A gentle hush fell across the rooftops as the last raindrop slid from the gutter's edge and disappeared into the earth. Lanterns were lit in the windows, and a faint fragrance of cooking rice and ginger wafted through the streets. Life resumed its rhythm, but she did not return to it. She was at the edge of the city now, where the stone road became dust, and the dust became grass. A narrow path led into the hills beyond the same hills she had once dreamed of as a child, when she believed there were gods waiting on the other side. She followed it. There were no witnesses to her departure, no trumpets, no tears, just the sound of her footsteps and the rustle of the wind through the bamboo. She found a place beneath a tree, old, wide, and blooming with white flowers, even in the shadow of dusk. She sat there, drew her knees to her chest, and closed her eyes, and in that stillness beneath the petals, against the bark she found it, not freedom, not escape, but peace. A kind of hush that filled her from throat to belly, a silence deeper than any conversation she had ever pretended to enjoy. For the first time, her breath was hers, and in the heart of the hills, far from the brothel, far from names and silken shadows, she began again. No longer concubine, no longer ornament, no longer anyone's. Just a woman, a breath, a bloom, and the petals continued to fall.